State and Revolution, Chapter 4, Supplementary Explanations by Engels. Marx gave the fundamentals on the question of the meaning of the experience of the commune. Engels returned to the same question repeatedly, elucidating Marx's analysis and conclusions, sometimes so forcibly throwing other sides of the question into relief that we must dwell on these explanations separately. Section 1. The Housing Question. In his work on the Housing Question, 1872, Engels took into account the experiences of the commune, dwelling repeatedly on the tasks of the revolution in relation to the state. It is interesting to note that, in the treatment of this concrete subject, there became clear, on the one hand, the features common to the proletarian state and the present state, features which permit of speaking of a state in both cases, and, on the other hand, the features which differentiate them, or the transition to the destruction of the state.
How, then, is the housing question to be solved? In present-day society, it is solved as every other social question is solved, by the gradual economic equalization of supply and demand, a solution which ever anew begets the very same question, and is consequently no solution at all. How a special revolution would solve this question depends not only on the circumstances then existing, but is also connected with much more far-reaching questions, one of the most important of which is the abolition of the antagonism between town and country. It is not our business to make any utopian systems for the organization of the society of the future. It would be more than idle to go into this. But this much at least is certain, that in the large towns there are already enough dwelling houses, if these were made rational use of, to immediately relieve any real housing shortage. This, of course, can only be done by the expropriation of the present owners, and by quartering in their houses workers who are homeless or are excessively overcrowded in their present quarters. And as soon as the proletariat has conquered political power, such a measure, demanded in the interest of public welfare, would be as easy to carry through as other expropriations and quarterings by the state of today.
Here the change in form of the state power is not considered, but only the content of its activity. Expropriations and the occupation of houses take place by order even of the present state. The proletarian state, from the formal point of view, will also order the occupation of houses and expropriation of buildings, but it is clear that the old executive apparatus, the bureaucracy, connected with the bourgeoisie, would simply be unfit to carry out the orders of the proletarian state.
It must, however, be stated that the actual seizure of possession of all instruments of labor, the taking possession of the whole of industry by the working people, is the direct opposite of the Proudhonist solution. In the latter, the individual worker becomes the owner of a house, a farm, and the instruments of labor. In the former, the working people remains the collective owner of the houses, factories, and instruments of labor, and will hardly, at any rate during the transition period, hand over the usufruct of these to individuals or companies unless the costs are met by them. It is just the same as with the abolition of property in land, which is not the abolition of ground rent, but only its transfer, even though in modified form, to society. The actual taking possession of all instruments of labor by the working people therefore by no means excludes the retention of rent relations.
One question touched upon here, namely, the economic reasons for the withering away of the state, we shall discuss in the next chapter. Engels expresses himself most cautiously, saying that the proletarian state will hardly allot these houses without pay, at any rate during a transition period. The renting out to separate families of houses belonging to the whole people presupposes the collection of rent, a certain amount of control, and some rules underlying the allotment of houses. All this demands a certain form of state, but it does not at all demand a special military and bureaucratic apparatus, with officials occupying especially privileged positions. transition to a state of affairs when it will be possible to let houses without rent is bound up with the complete withering away of the state. Speaking of the conversion of the Blanquists, after the Commune and under the influence of its experience, to the principles of Marxism, Engels, in passing, formulates these principles as follows.
Necessity of political action by the proletariat and its dictatorship as the transition to the abolition of classes and, with them, the state.
Those addicted to hair-splitting criticism and those who belong to the bourgeois exterminators of Marxism might perhaps see a contradiction in the above quotation of the anti-Düring between this avowal of the abolition of the state and the repudiation of a formula like the anarchist one. It would not be surprising if the opportunist stamped Engels too as an anarchist, for the social chauvinists are now more and more adopting the method of accusing the internationalists of anarchism. That, together with the abolition of classes, the state will also be abolished, Marxism has always taught. The well-known passage on the withering away of the state in the anti-Düring does not blame the anarchists for being in favor of the abolition of the state, but for preaching that the state can be abolished within 24 hours, in view of the fact that the present predominant social democratic doctrine completely distorts the relation of Marxism to anarchism on the question of the abolition of the state. It will be quite useful to recall a certain polemic of Marx and Engels against the anarchists. Section 2. Polemic against the Anarchists. This polemic took place in 1873. Marx and Engels contributed articles against the Proudhonists, autonomists, or anti-authoritarians to an Italian socialist publication, and it was not until 1913 that these articles appeared in German translation in the New Zeit.
When the political struggle of the working class,
wrote Marx, ridiculing the anarchists for the repudiation of political action,
assumes a revolutionary form, when the workers set up in place of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie their revolutionary dictatorship, then they commit the terrible crime of outraging principle, for in order to satisfy their wretched, vulgar, everyday needs, in order to break down the resistance of the bourgeoisie, they give the state a revolutionary and transitional form, instead of laying down arms and abolishing the state.
It was exclusively against this kind of abolition of the state that Marx fought, refuting the anarchists. He fought not against the theory of the disappearance of the state when classes disappear, or of its abolition when classes have been abolished, but against the proposition that the workers should deny themselves the use of arms, the use of organized force, that is, the use of the state, for the purpose of breaking down the resistance of the bourgeoisie. In order that the true sense of his fight against the anarchists might not be perverted, Marx purposely emphasizes the revolutionary and transitional form of the state, necessary for the proletariat. The proletariat needs the state only for a while. We do not at all disagree with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as an aim. We maintain that, to achieve this aim, temporary use must be made of the instruments, means, and methods of the state power against the exploiters, just as the dictatorship of the oppressed class is temporarily necessary for the annihilation of classes. Marx chooses the sharpest and clearest way of stating his position against the anarchists. When they have cast off the yoke of the capitalists, ought the workers to lay down arms, or ought they use them against the capitalists in order to crush their resistance? But what is the systematic use of arms by one class against the other, if not a transitional form of state? Let every social democrat ask himself, was that the way in which he approached the question of the state in his discussion with the anarchists? Was that the way in which the vast majority of the official social democratic parties of the Second International approached it? Engels develops these same ideas in even greater detail and more simply. He first of all ridicules the muddled ideas of the Proudhonists, who called themselves anti-authoritarians. That is, they denied every kind of authority, every kind of subordination, every kind of power.
Take a factory, a railway, a vessel on the high seas,
said Engels.
Is it not clear that not one of these complex technical units, based on the use of machines, and the ordered cooperation of many people could function without a certain amount of subordination, and consequently without some authority or power. When I put these arguments, writes Engels, up against the most rabid anti-authoritarians, they are only able to give me the following answer. Ah, that is true, but here it is not a case of authority conferred on the delegates, but of a commission, which we give them. These people think that they can change a thing by changing its name.
Having thus shown that authority and autonomy are relative terms, that the sphere of their application varies with the various phases of social development, that it is absurd to take them as absolute concepts, having added that the sphere of the application of machinery in large-scale production is ever extending, Engels passes from a general discussion of authority to the question of the state.
If the autonomists, he writes, had been content to say that the social organization of the future would permit authority only within the limits in which the relations of production made it inevitable, then it would have been possible to come to an understanding with them, but they are blind to all facts which make authority necessary, and they fight passionately against the word. Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, against the state? All socialists are agreed that the state and political authority along with it will disappear as the result of the coming social revolution. That is, that public functions will lose their political character and be transformed into simple administrative functions of watching over social interests. But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state should be abolished at one stroke, even before the social relations which give birth to it have been abolished. They demand that the first act of the social revolution should be the abolition of authority. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? Revolution is undoubtedly the most authoritative thing possible. It is an act in which one section of the population imposes its will on the other by means of rifles, bayonets, cannon, i.e., by highly authoritative means, and the victorious party is inevitably forced to maintain its supremacy by means of that fear which its arms inspire in the reactionaries. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day had it not relied on the authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Are we not, on the contrary, entitled to blame the Commune for not having made sufficient use of this authority? And so, either the anti-authoritarians do not know what they are talking about, in which case they merely sow confusion, or they do know, in which case they are betraying the cause of the proletariat. In either case, they serve only the interests of reaction.
In this discussion, questions are touched upon which must be examined in connection with the subject of the interrelation of politics and economics during the withering away of the state. The next chapter is devoted to this subject. Such are the questions of the transformation of public functions from political into simply administrative ones, and of the political state. This last term, political state, particularly liable to cause misunderstanding, indicates the process of the withering away of the state, the dying state, at a certain stage of its withering away. It can be called a non-political state. The most remarkable point in our quotation from Engels is again the way he states the case against the anarchists. Social democrats, desiring to be disciples of Engels, have discussed this question with the anarchists millions of times since 1873, but they have not discussed it as Marxists can and should. The anarchist idea of the abolition of the state is muddled and non-revolutionary. That is how Engels put it. It is precisely the revolution, in its rise and development, with its specific tasks in relation to violence, authority, power, the state, that the anarchists do not wish to see. The customary criticism of anarchism by modern social democrats has been reduced to the purest Philistine vulgarity.
We recognize the state, whereas the anarchists do not.
Naturally, such vulgarity can only repel revolutionary working men who think at all. Engels says something different. He emphasizes that all socialists recognize the disappearance of the state as a result of the socialist revolution. He then deals with the concrete question of the revolution, that very question which, as a rule, the Social Democrats, because of their opportunism, evade, leaving it, so to speak, exclusively for the anarchists to work out. And in thus formulating the question, Engels takes the bull by the horns. Ought not the Commune to have made more use of the revolutionary power of the state, that is, of the proletariat armed and organized as the ruling class? Prevailing official social democracy usually dismissed the question as to the concrete tasks of the proletariat in the revolution either with an inane Philistine shrug, or, at the best, with the evasive sophism, "Wait and see." And the anarchists were thus justified in saying about such a social democracy that it had betrayed the task of educating the working class for the revolution. Engels makes use of the experience of the last proletarian revolution for the particular purpose of making a concrete analysis as to what the proletariat should do in relation both to the banks and the state, and how it should do it. Section 3. Letter to Bebel. One of the most remarkable, if not the most remarkable, observation on the state to be found in the works of Marx and Engels is contained in the passage of Engels' letter to Bebel dated March 18 through 28, 1875. This letter, we may remark in passing, was first published, as so far we know, by Bebel in the second volume of his memoirs, published in 1911, that is 36 years after it had been written and mailed. Engels wrote to Bebel criticizing that same draft of the Gotha program which Marx also criticized in his famous letter to Brock. Referencing particularly the question of the state, Engels said, "The people's free state has been transformed into a free state. According to the grammatical meaning of the words, the free state is one in which the state is free in relation to its citizens, that is, a state with a despotic government. It will be well to throw overboard all this chatter about the state, especially after the Commune, which was no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. The anarchists have too long thrown this people's state into our teeth, although already in Marx's work against Proudhon, and then in the Communist Manifesto, it was stated definitely that, with the introduction of the socialist order of society, the state will dissolve of itself and disappear, as the state is only a transitional phenomenon which must be made use of in struggle in the revolution in order to forcibly crush our antagonists. It is pure absurdity to speak of a people's free state. As long as the proletariat still needs the state, it needs it not in the interest of freedom, but for the purpose of crushing its antagonists, and as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, then the state, as such, ceases to exist. We would therefore suggest that everywhere the word state be replaced by community, a fine old German word which corresponds to the French word commune. One must bear in mind that this letter refers to the party program, which Marx criticized in his letter dated only a few weeks later than the above. Marx's letter is dated May 5th, 1875, and that Engels was living at the time with Marx in London. Consequently, when he says "we" in the last sentence, Engels undoubtedly suggests to the leader of the German Workers' Party, both in his own and in Marx's name, that the word state should be struck out of the program and replaced by community. What a howl about anarchism could be raised by the leaders of present-day Marxism, adulterated to meet the requirements of the opportunists if such a rectifying of the program were suggested to them. Let them howl. The bourgeoisie will praise them for it. But we shall go on with our work. In revising the program of our party, the advice of Engels and Marx absolutely must be taken into consideration in order to come nearer to the truth, to re-establish Marxism, to purge it of distortions, to direct more correctly the struggle of the working class for its liberation. Among the Bolsheviks there will certainly be none opposed to the advice of Engels and Marx. Difficulties may perhaps crop up only regarding terminology. In German there are two words meaning community, of which Engels used the one which does not denote a single community, but the totality, the system of communities. In Russian there is no such word, and perhaps we may have to decide to use the French word commune, although this also has its drawbacks.
The commune was no longer a state in the proper sense of the word.
This is Engels' most important statement, theoretically speaking. After what has been presented above, this statement is perfectly clear. The commune ceased to be a state insofar as it had to repress not the majority of the population, but a minority, the exploiters. It had broken the bourgeois state machinery. In the place of a special repressive force, the whole population itself came onto the scene. All this is a departure from the state in its proper sense. And had the commune asserted itself as a lasting power, remnants of the state would themselves have withered away within it. It would not have been necessary to abolish its institutions. They would have ceased to function in proportion as less and less was left for them to do.
The anarchists throw this people's state into our teeth.
In saying this, Engels has in mind, especially Bakunin, and his attacks on the German Social Democrats. Engels admits these attacks to be justified insofar as the people's state is as senseless, and as much as a deviation from socialism, as the people's free state. Engels tries to improve the struggle of the German Social Democrats against the anarchists, to make the struggle correct in principle, to purge it of opportunistic prejudices concerning the state. Alas, Engels' letter has been pigeonholed for 36 years. We shall see below that, even after the publication of Engels' letter, Kautsky obstinately repeats in essence the very mistakes against which Engels warned. Bebel replied to Engels in a letter dated September 21st, 1875, in which, among other things, he wrote that he fully agreed with Engels' criticism of the draft program, and that he had reproached Liebknecht for his readiness to make concessions. But if we take Bebel's pamphlet, Unser Ziel, we find in there absolutely wrong views regarding the state.
The state must be transformed from one based on class domination into a people state.
This is printed in the ninth edition of Bebel's pamphlet. Small wonder that such constantly repeated opportunist views regarding the state were absorbed by German social democracy, especially as Engels' revolutionary interpretations were safely pigeonholed, and all the conditions of everyday life were such as to wean the people from revolution for a long time. Section 4. Criticism of the draft of the Erfurt program. In analyzing the doctrines of Marxism on the state, the criticism of the draft of the Erfurt program sent by Engels to Kautsky on June 29, 1891, a criticism published only 10 years later in New Zeit, cannot be overlooked, for this criticism is mainly concerned with the opportunist views of social democracy regarding questions of state organization. We may note in passing that in the field of economics Engels also makes an exceedingly valuable observation, which shows how attentively and thoughtfully he followed the changes in modern capitalism, and how he was able, in a measure, to foresee the problems of our own, the imperialist epoch. Here is a point touching on the word planlessness, used in the draft program as characteristic of capitalism.
When we pass from joint stock companies to trusts which control and monopolize whole branches of industry, not only private production comes to an end at that point, but also planlessness.
Here we have what is most essential in the theoretical appreciation of the latest phase of capitalism, i.e., imperialism, that capitalism becomes monopoly capitalism. This fact must be emphasized because the bourgeois reformist view that monopoly capitalism or state monopoly capitalism is no longer capitalism, but can already be termed state socialism or something of that sort, is a very widespread error. The trusts, of course, have not created, do not create now, and cannot create full and complete planning. But, however much of a plan they may create, however closely capitalist magnates may estimate in advance the extent of production on a national level and even an international scale, however systematically they may regulate it, we still remain under capitalism. Capitalism, it is true, in its new stage, but still, unquestionably, capitalism. The proximity of such capitalism to socialism should serve for the real representatives of the proletariat as an argument proving the nearness, ease, feasibility, and urgency of the socialist revolution, and not at all as an argument for tolerating a repudiation of such a revolution or for making capitalism more attractive, in which work all the reformists are engaged. But to return to the question of the state, Engels makes here three kinds of valuable suggestions. First, as regards a republic. Second, as to the connection between the national question and the form of the state. And third, as to self-government. As to a republic, Engels made this point the center of gravity of his criticism of the draft of the Erfurt program. And when we remember what importance the Erfurt program has acquired in international social democracy, how it has become the model for the whole of the Second International, it may, without exaggeration, be said that Engels thereby criticized the opportunism of the whole Second International.
The political demands of the draft, Engels writes, have one great defect. The point that should particularly have been stated is not among them.
And, later on, he makes it clear that the German constitution is but a copy of the reactionary constitution of 1850, that the Reichstag is only, as Wilhelm Liebknecht put it, the fig leaf of absolutism, and that to wish to transform all the means of production into public property on the basis of a constitution which legalizes the existence of petty states and the federation of petty German states is an obvious absurdity.
It is dangerous to touch on this subject,
Engels adds, knowing full well that it is impossible for police reasons to include in the program an openly stated demand for a republic in Germany. But Engels does not rest content with this obvious consideration which satisfies everybody. He continues,
and yet, in one way or another, the question must be tackled. How necessary this is shown precisely at this moment by the opportunism which is gaining ground in a large section of the social democratic press. Because they fear the reenactment of the anti-socialist law, because they have in mind all kinds of premature declarations made when that law was in full force, now all at once we are told that the legal situation now existing in Germany can suffice the party for the realization of all its demands by peaceful methods.
That the German Social Democrats were actuated by fear of the renewal of the exception law. This fundamental fact Engels stresses particularly, and, without hesitation, he calls this opportunism, declaring that just because of the absence of a republic and freedom in Germany, the dreams of a peaceful path were perfectly absurd. Engels is sufficiently careful not to tie his hands. He admits that in republican or very free countries, one can only conceive, of a peaceful development toward socialism. But in Germany, he repeats,
in Germany, where the government is almost all-powerful and the Reichstag and all other representative bodies have no real power to proclaim such a thing in Germany, and moreover, when there is no need to do so, is to remove the fig leaf from absolutism, and to screen its nakedness by one's own body.
The great majority of the official leaders of the German Social Democratic Party who pigeonholed this advice has indeed proved to be a screen for absolutism.
Such a policy can only lead to their own party permanently astray. General and abstract political questions are pushed into the foreground, thus covering up the immediate concrete issues, the issues which, at the first great events, at the first political crisis, put themselves on the order of the day. What else can come of it but that suddenly, at the decisive moment, the party will be helpless, and that there will be a lack of clarity and unity on the most decisive points, for the reason that these points have never been discussed. This neglect of the great fundamental issues for momentary day-to-day interest, this striving and struggling for momentary success without regard to further consequences, this sacrifice of the future of the movement for the sake of its immediate position may be honestly meant, but opportunism it is and remains, and honest opportunism is perhaps the most dangerous of all. If anything is certain, it is that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of the democratic republic. This is, indeed, the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as has already been shown by the great French Revolution.
Engels repeats here a particularly emphatic form, the fundamental idea which runs like a red thread throughout all Marx's work, namely, that the democratic republic is the nearest approach to the dictatorship of the proletariat. For such a republic, without in the least setting aside the domination of capital, and therefore the oppression of the masses and the class struggle, inevitably leads to such an extension, development, unfolding, and sharpening of that struggle that, as soon as the possibility arises for satisfying the fundamental interest of the oppressed masses, this possibility is realized inevitably and solely in the dictatorship of the proletariat, in the guidance of these masses by the proletariat. These also have been, for the whole of the Second International, forgotten words of Marxism, and this forgetting was demonstrated with particular vividness by the history of the Menshevik Party during the first half of the Russian Revolution of 1917. On the question of a federal republic in connection with the national composition of the population, Engels wrote,
"What should take the place of present-day Germany, with its reactionary monarchical constitution and its equally reactionary division into petty states, which perpetuates all that is specifically Prussian instead of merging it in Germany as a whole? In my view, the proletariat can use only the form of the one and indivisible republic. In the gigantic territory of the United States, a federal republic is still, on the whole, a necessity, although in the eastern states it is already becoming a hindrance. It would be a step forward in England, where the two islands are peopled by 4 nations, and in spite of a single parliament 3 different systems of legislation exist side by side even today. In little Switzerland, it has long been a hindrance, tolerable only because Switzerland is content to be purely a passive member of the European state system. For Germany, federation of the Swiss type would be an enormous step backward. 2 points distinguish a federal state from a unitary state: that each separate federated state, each canton, has its own civil and criminal legislation and judicial system, and then, that alongside of a popular chamber there is also a House of Representatives from the states, in which each canton, large or small, votes as such. Fortunately, we have got over the first, and we shall not be so childish as to introduce it again, and we have the second in the Federal Council, and could very well do without it, especially as our federal state already forms the transition to the unitary state. And it is not our task to reverse from above the revolution carried out in 1866 and 1870, but to give it its necessary completion and improvements through a movement from below.
Engels not only shows no indifference to the question of the forms of the state, but, on the contrary, tries to analyze with the utmost care the transitional forms, in order to establish in accordance with the concrete historical peculiarities of each separate case, from what and to what the given transitional form is evolving. From the point of view of the proletariat and the proletarian revolution, Engels, like Marx, insists on democratic centralism, on one indivisible republic. The federal republic he considers either as an exception and a hindrance to development, or as a transitional form from a monarchy to a centralized republic, as a step forward under certain special conditions. And among these special conditions, the national question arises. Engels, like Marx, in spite of their ruthless criticism of the reactionary nature of small states, and, in certain concrete cases, the screening of this by the national question, never shows a trace of desire to ignore the national question, a desire of which the Dutch and Polish Marxists are often guilty, as a result of their most justifiable opposition to the narrow Philistine nationalism of their little states. Even in England, where geographical conditions, common language, and the history of many countries would seem to have put an end to the national question in the separate small divisions of England, even here Engels is cognizant of the patent fact that the national question has not yet been overcome, and recognizes, in consequence, that the establishment of a federal republic would be a step forward. Of course, there is no trace here of refusing to criticize the defects of the federal republic or to conduct the most determined propaganda and fight for a united, centralized democratic republic. But Engels by no means understands democratic centralism in the bureaucratic sense, in which this term is used by bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideologists, including anarchists. Centralism does not, with Engels, in the least exclude such wide local self-government, which combines a voluntary defense of the unity of the state by the communes and districts with complete abolition of all bureaucracy, and all commanding from above.
So then, a unitary republic,
writes Engels, setting forth the programmatic views of Marxism on the state,
but not in the sense of the present French Republic, which is nothing more but the empire established in 1798 minus the emperor. From 1792 to 1798, each department of France, each local area, enjoyed complete self-government on the American model, and this is what we too must have. How self-government is to be organized, and how we can manage without a bureaucracy, has been demonstrated to us by America and the First French Republic, and is being demonstrated even today by Australia, Canada, and the other English colonies. And a provincial and local self-government of this type is far freer than, for example, Swiss federalism, in which it is true the canton is very independent in relation to the Bund, i.e., the federated state as a whole, but it is also independent in relation to the district and the local area. The cantonal governments appoint the district governors and prefects, a feature which is unknown in English-speaking countries, and which in the future we shall have to abolish here, along with the Prussian commissaries, district police chiefs, governors, and in general all officials appointed from above.
In accordance with this, Engels suggests the following wording for the clause in the program regarding self-government.
Complete self-government for the provinces, districts, and local areas through officials elected by universal suffrage. The abolition of all local and provincial authorities appointed by the state.
In the Pravda, suppressed by the government of Kerensky and other socialist ministers, I have already had occasion to point out how in this connection, not by any means in this alone, our sham socialist representatives of the sham revolutionary sham democracy have scandalously departed from democracy. Naturally, people who have bound themselves by a coalition with the imperialist bourgeoisie remained deaf to this criticism. It is highly important to note that Engels, armed with facts, disproves by a telling example the superstition, very widespread, especially among the petty bourgeois democracy, that a federal republic necessarily means a greater amount of freedom than a centralized republic. This is not true. It is disproved by the facts cited by Engels regarding the centralized French Republic of 1792 through 1798 and the Federal Swiss Republic. The really democratic centralized republic gave more freedom than the federal republic. In other words, the greatest amount of local, provincial, and other freedom known in history was granted by a centralized and not a federal republic. Insufficient attention has been and is being paid to this fact in our party propaganda and agitation, as, indeed, to the whole question of federal and centralized republics and local self-government. Section 5. The 1891 Preface to Marx's Civil War in France. It is preface to the third edition of The Civil War in France. This preface is dated March 18th, 1891, and was originally published in the New Zeit, Engels, with many other interesting remarks, made in passing, on questions of the attitude towards the state, gives a remarkably striking resume of the lessons of the Commune. This resume, confirmed by all the experience of the period of 20 years separating the author from the Commune, and directed particularly against the superstitious faith in the state, so widely diffused in Germany, can justly be called the last word of Marxism on the question dealt with here. In France, Engels observes the workers were armed after every revolution. This summing up of the experience of bourgeois revolutions is as concise as it is expressive. The essence of the whole matter also, by the way of the question of the state, has the oppressed class, arms, is here remarkably well defined. It is just this essential thing which is most ignored by both professors under the influence of bourgeois ideology and by the petty bourgeois Democrats. In the Russian Revolution of 1917, the honor of babbling out the secret of bourgeois revolutions fell to the Menshevik,
also Marxist,
Tseretelli. In his historic speech of June 22nd, Tseretelli blurted out the decision of the bourgeoisie to disarm the Petrograd workers, referring, of course, to this decision as his own, and as a vital necessity for the state. Tseretelli's historic speech of June 22nd will certainly constitute for every historian of the Revolution of 1917 one of the clearest illustrations of how the bloc of socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, led by Mr. Tseretelli, went over to the side of the bourgeoisie against the revolutionary proletariat. Another incidental remark of Engels's, also connected with the question of the state, deals with religion. It is well known that German social democracy, in proportion as it began to decay and become more and more opportunist, slid down more and more frequently into the Philistine misinterpretation of the celebrated formula, "Religion is a private matter." That is, this formula was twisted to mean that even for the party of the revolutionary proletariat, the question of religion was a private matter. It was against this complete betrayal of the revolutionary program of the proletariat that Engels revolted. In 1891, he only saw the very feeble beginnings of opportunism in his party, and therefore he expressed himself on the subject most cautiously.
As almost without exception, workers or recognized representatives of the workers sat in the Commune. Its decisions bore decidedly proletarian character. Either they decreed reforms which the Republican bourgeoisie had failed to pass only out of cowardice, but which provided a necessary basis for the free activity of the working class, such as the adoption of the principle that in relation to the state religion is a purely private affair, or they promulgated decrees directly in the interest of the working class, and to some extent cutting deeply into the old order of society.
Engels directly emphasized the words "in relation to the state" as a straight thrust at the heart of German opportunism, which had declared religion to be a private matter in relation to the party, thus lowering the party of the revolutionary proletariat to the most vulgar, free-thinking Philistine level, ready to allow a non-denominational status, but renouncing all party struggle against the religious opium which stupefies the people. The future historian of German social democracy, in investigating the basic causes of its shameful collapse in 1914, will find no little material of interest on this question, beginning with the evasive declarations in the articles of the ideological leader of the party, Kautsky, which opened the door wide to opportunism, and ending with the attitude of the party towards the movement for disestablishment of the Church in 1913. But let us see how, 20 years after the Commune, Engels summed up its lessons for the fighting proletariat. Here are the lessons to which Engels attached prime importance.
It was precisely this oppressive power of the former centralized government, the army, political police, and bureaucracy, which Napoleon had created in 1798, and since then had been taken over as a welcome instrument by every new government and used against its opponents. It was precisely this power which should have fallen everywhere, as it had already fallen in Paris. The Commune was compelled to recognize from the outset that the working class, once come to power, could not carry on business with the old state machine, that, in order not to lose again its own position of power, which it had but just conquered, this working class must, on the one hand, set aside all the old repressive machinery previously used against itself, and, on the other, safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials by declaring them all, without exception, subject to recall at any moment.
Engels' emphasis again and again that not only in a monarchy, but also in a democratic republic, the state remains a state, i.e., it retains its fundamental and characteristic feature of transforming the officials, the servants of society, its organs, into the masters of society.
Against this transformation of the state and the organs of the state from servants of society into masters of society, a process which had been inevitable in all previous states, the Commune made use of two infallible remedies. In the first place, it filled all posts, administrative, judicial, and educational, by election on the basis of universal suffrage of all concerned, with the right of these electors to recall the delegate at any time. And in the second place, all officials, high or low, were paid only the wages received by other workers. The highest salary paid by the Commune to anyone was 6,000 francs. In this way, an effective barrier to place hunting and careerism was set up, even apart from the imperative mandates to delegates to representative bodies, which were also added in profusion.
Engels approaches here the interesting boundary line where consistent democracy is, on the one hand, transformed into socialism, and on the other, it demands the introduction of socialism. For, in order to destroy the state, it is necessary to convert the functions of public service into such simple operations of control and accounting as are within the reach of the vast majority of the population, and ultimately of every single individual. And, in order to do completely away with careerism, it must be made impossible for an honorable, though unsalaried post in the public service to be used as a springboard to a highly profitable post in the banks or the joint stock companies, as happens constantly in all the freest capitalist countries. But Engels does not make the mistake made, for instance, by some Marxists in dealing with the right of a nation to self-determination, that this is impossible under capitalism and will be unnecessary under socialism. Such an apparently clever but really incorrect statement might be replaced of any democratic institution, including moderate salaries for officials, for under capitalism, fully consistent democracy is impossible, while under socialism, all democracy withers away. This is a sophism, comparable to the old humorous problem of whether a man is becoming bald if he loses one hair. To develop democracy to its logical conclusion, to find the forms for this development, to test them by practice, and so forth, all this is one of the fundamental tasks of the struggle for the social revolution. Taken separately, no kind of democracy will yield socialism, but in actual life, democracy will never be taken separately. It will be taken together with other things. It will exert its influence on economic life, stimulating its reorganization. It will be subjected in its turn to the influence of economic development, and so on. Such is the dialectics of living history. Engels continues,
This shattering of the former state power and its replacement by a new and really democratic state is described in detail in the third section of The Civil War. but it was necessary here once more to dwell briefly on some of its features, because in Germany particularly, the superstitious faith in the state has been carried over from philosophy into the general consciousness of the bourgeoisie, and even of many workers. According to the philosophical conception, the state is the realization of the idea, or, translated into philosophical language, the kingdom of God on earth, the sphere in which eternal truth and justice is, or should be, realized. And from this then follows a superstitious reverence for the state, and for everything connected with it, which takes root the more readily as people from their childhood are accustomed to imagine that the affairs and interests common to the whole of society could not be managed and safeguarded in any other way than as in the past, that is, through the state and its well-paid officials. And people think they are taking quite an extraordinarily bold step forward when they rid themselves of faith in a hereditary monarchy, and become partisans of a democratic republic. In reality, however, the state is nothing more than a machine for the oppression of one class by another, and indeed, in the democratic republic no less than in the monarchy, and at best an evil inherited by the proletariat after its victorious struggle for class supremacy, whose worst sides the proletariat, just like the commune, will have at the earliest possible moment to lop off, until such a time as a new generation, reared under a new and free social condition, will be able to throw on the scrap-heap all this state rubbish.
Engels cautioned the Germans, in the event of the monarchy being replaced by a republic, not to forget the fundamentals of socialism on the question of the state in general. His warnings now read like a direct lecture to Messrs. Tseretelli and Chernov, who repealed in their coalition tactics a superstitious faith in, and a respect for, the state. 2 more points. First, when Engels says that in a democratic republic, no less than in a monarchy, the state remains a machine for the oppressed of one class by another, this by no means signifies that the form of oppression is a matter of indifference to the proletariat, as some anarchists teach. A wider, freer, and more open form of the class struggle and of class oppression enormously assists the proletariat in its struggle for the abolition of all classes. Second, why only a new generation will be able to completely throw out all the state rubbish? This question is bound up with the question of overcoming democracy, to which we now turn. Section 6. Engels on the overcoming of democracy. Engels had on occasion to speak on the subject in connection with the question of the scientific incorrectness of the term social democrat. In the introduction to an edition of his articles of the 70s on various subjects, mainly in the international questions, dated January 3, 1894, that is, written a year and a half before his death, Engels wrote that in all his articles he used the word communist, not social democrat, because at the time it was the Proudhonists in France and the Lassalleans in Germany who called themselves social democrats.
For Marx and me,
Engels writes,
it was therefore quite impossible to choose such an elastic term to characterize our special point of view. Today things are different, and the word social democrat may perhaps pass muster, however unsuitable it is for a party whose economic program is not merely socialist in general, but directly communist, and whose ultimate political aim is to overcome the whole state, and therefore democracy as well. The names of real political parties, however, are never wholly appropriate. The party develops, while the name persists.
The dialectician Engels remains true to dialectics to the end of his days. Marx and I, he says, had a splendid scientifically exact name for the party, but there was no real party, that is, no proletarian mass party. Now, at the end of the 19th century, there is a real party, but its name is scientifically inexact. Never mind, it will pass muster. Only let the party grow, do not let the scientific inexactness of its name be hidden from it, and do not let it hinder its development in the right direction. Perhaps, indeed, some humorists might comfort us Bolsheviks in the manner of Engels. We have a real party. It is developing splendidly. Even such a meaningless and awkward term as Bolshevik will pass muster, although it expresses nothing but the purely accidental fact that at the Brussels-London Congress of 1903 we had a majority. Perhaps now, when the July and August persecutions of our party by Republican and revolutionary petty bourgeois democracy have made the word Bolshevik such a universally respected name, when, in addition, these persecutions have signalized such a great historical step forward made by our party in its actual development, perhaps now even I would hesitate to repeat my April suggestion as to changing the name of our party. Perhaps I would propose a compromise to our comrades, to call ourselves the Communist Party, but to retain the word Bolsheviks in brackets. But the question of the name of the party is incomparably less important than the question of the relation of the revolutionary proletariat to the state. In the current arguments about the state, the mistake is constantly made, against which Engels cautions here, and which we have indicated above, namely, it is constantly forgotten that the destruction of the state means also the destruction of democracy, that the withering away of the state also means the withering away of democracy. At first sight, such a statement seems exceedingly strange and incomprehensible. Indeed, some may even begin to fear lest we be expecting the advent of such an order of society in which the principle of the subordination of the minority to the majority will not be respected. For is not a democracy just the recognition of this principle?
No, democracy is not identical with the subordination of the minority to the majority. Democracy is a state recognizing the subordination of the minority to the majority. That is, an organization for the systematic use of violence by one class against the other, by one part of the population against the other. We set ourselves the ultimate aim of destroying the state, that is, every organized and systematic violence, every use of violence against man in general. We do not expect the advent of an order of society in which the principle of subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed. But, striving for socialism, we are convinced that it will develop into communism, that side by side with this there will vanish all need for force, for the subjection of one man to another, and of one part of the population to another, since people will grow accustomed to observing the elementary conditions of social existence without force and without subjection. In order to emphasize this element of habit, Engels speaks of a new generation, reared under new and free social conditions, which will be able to throw on the scrap heap all this state rubbish, every kind of state, including even the democratically republican state. For the elucidation of this, the question of the economic basis of the withering away of the state must be analyzed.